This is one of the important things about understanding how the brain works, because if you understand that pretty much everything you experience is a combination of meanings from the past, the signals from the sensory surfaces of your body and the signals in your brain are constraining each other to create meaning, to give, that's really what your experience is and, what your actions are. Once you understand this, then you can kind of use that deliberately to cultivate new experiences for yourself that you can deliberately cultivate with energy, with effort. But then eventually, if you practice, your brain can start to construct experiences really easily, very effortlessly. And it becomes a set of tools that you can use to literally change your experience of the world.
Collective Insights is a voyage through topics and technologies revolutionizing human well-being. Groundbreaking approaches for a better world and a better life await you. Welcome to Collective Insights.
Hi, I'm Dr. Gregory Kelly. And before we get into this week's episode, I want to talk about one of the most important molecules in your body to help you age well. I'm talking about NAD+. High NAD+ levels help our bodies stay youthful in so many ways, such as creating energy, maintaining healthy DNA, detecting and using nutrients efficiently, and protecting your cellular health. But in our 30s and 40s, our NAD levels start to plummet. That's why our science team made Qualia NAD+. Qualia NAD+ is a clinically tested formula with an uncommonly advanced approach. It can boost NAD+ levels up to 50% by combining 14 key ingredients, including 3 premium NAD+ precursors, working together to support NAD+ production deep into life. To learn more about NAD+ research and to try Qualia NAD+ risk-free for 100 days, go to qualialife.com/NAD15 and use code NAD15 for 15% off Qualia. That's NAD15 for better aging at qualialife.com/NAD15. Hi, this is Dr. Greg. I'll be the host for today's episode, and today we're lucky to have Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's in the top 1% of the most cited scientists in the world for her revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. She's a university distinguished professor and holds research appointments at Massachusetts General Hospital and has published over 280 peer-reviewed published papers. Dr. Barrett, welcome back to the show today.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I was just mentioning to you before we went live what a big fan of your books I've been. And we're going to really focus on the 7.5 lessons about the brain today, but I've read them both and can't recommend them high enough to listeners that may not have yet. So maybe we'll just jump right in and you can share with our listeners why you decided to write that book.
When I wrote 7.5 Lessons about the brain, I had a couple of goals in mind. One was that I've never written a set of essays before to publish, and I'm really a fan of that form, of that writing form. And I think it's really hard to write essays. So that was one goal, was to just try my hand at something I hadn't done before and that I really admire. And I think the second reason is that I wanted to distill down ideas about brain function into these bite-sized nuggets to try to invite people who are not so interested in science to engage with science a little bit and see how it could be useful for their life. So the goal was to get people thinking about really big ideas about human nature by writing about a couple of little scientific tidbits, that they could kind of take to a dinner party, entertain their friends with, press their mothers with, or whatever. But really that would not so much answer questions about what it means to be human, but to invite them to think about what it means to be human through the lens of neuroscience. And, many of these nuggets are in how emotions are made, but they're not at the forefront. They're not really foregrounded. They're really kind of background points for talking about emotion. But, in my life as a scientist, I kind of started off not even studying emotion, really. I mean, I sort of fell into that. And then through the study of emotion, I became more interested just in basic brain function and basic nervous system function. These are some of the points that interest me most, I think, some of the insights that I personally have gained from trying to work through a really specific set of scientific questions about the brain basis of emotion.
Well, and I know for me, I really appreciated the way you chunked it down into the smaller bite-sized pieces. I mentioned to you before we went live also that the first time I engaged it was driving to and from work, or I think there was some like the first half lesson that's shorter I did on a trip to the supermarket. And I loved it because I could really, in a bite-sized and manageable amount of time, feel like, oh, I just, really learned this important thing about my brain. So
that's perfect. I mean, that was exactly the intent. I personally like to read essays when I'm on the beach or at night in the bathtub as I'm getting ready for bed. And I thought, well, I'd like to give people an experience, a scientific experience that's meaningful in their own life. Like I said, leave them with a little tidbit of neuroscience they can just tuck in their pocket for whenever, it might be useful or fun to talk about. And that you could exactly do, you could finish it on a trip to the supermarket or trip to, work on a couple of subway stops, trip on a subway or whatever, just something contained. And of course, there is an appendix in the hard copy of the book, and there's also a website. This is something I kind of made up with how emotions are made. The scientist in me wants to provide full references, so I have. There's a website for 7.5 Lessons, which has all the references and pointers to other references for anybody who wants to really dig in and engage with the book as a more scientific document.
Oh, well, wonderful. We'll make sure we link to that. The book starts off, and one of the opening things is you begin by stating your brain is not thinking. And then, the theme that I pull out somewhat from that, what I think of as the first half lesson, you also go into much more detail in lesson 4. Your brain predicts, and then in parentheses, almost everything you do. And I think that idea of our brain as a prediction machine, for lack of a better way to describe it, really helped me understand my brain in a new way. So can we start maybe talking about that?
Sure. So when I said that your brain is not for thinking, what I meant by that was it didn't, we can't really say why anything evolved. I mean, that's just, scientists shouldn't do things like that. Philosophers, for philosophers tell us that's a no-no. But we can say, what are some of its most important jobs? And if you look at the evolution of the human brain, you can see that the brain's most important job is not thinking. Of course, we think and we feel and we see and we sense things, but those aren't the most important thing that a brain is for everyday life. It's doing those things, but it's doing those things in the service of regulating your body. So right now, as we're talking and as our listeners are listening, each of us has a whole drama going on inside us. The brain is controlling 600 muscles, and it's controlling glucose concentrations and oxygen concentrations, and it's monitoring, your heart rate and your breathing rate, and it's fighting illness. It's controlling your immune system, and when I say controlling, I mean there are some things like your heart and your gut that will continue to oscillate or beat. If it's given enough oxygen and glucose, it'll continue on its own for a little while. But you have to coordinate all these systems. We have hundreds and hundreds of systems and, gazillions of tissues, and they all have to be coordinated in a metabolically efficient way. That's a major pressure on health and illness. If your brain is not doing its job in a metabolically efficient way, if it's not regulating the body in an efficient way, then you end up paying little taxes and metaphorically speaking, and you end up getting sick. It takes a long time, but it happens. It turns out the most efficient way metabolically or energetically to regulate a system is to predict what the system needs and then correct when it's wrong, when the predictions are wrong. So the brain is constantly anticipating the energetic needs of the body and attempting to meet those needs before they arise. And this is a scientific concept called allostasis, not homeostasis, which is a different concept, but allostasis. And in the book and also in How Emotions Are Made, I use a metaphor for talking about the predictive regulation of the body, which I call body budgeting. And I just need to say, as you know, all metaphors are wrong, okay? Because they're simplifications. But some metaphors are useful without being too wrong. And so body budgeting, I think, is a good metaphor from my perspective, because your brain isn't really budgeting money. It's budgeting glucose and salt and oxygen and, all of the chemicals and nutrients that you need to take in and that you spend throughout the day. And so your brain has to basically body budget in an efficient way, and that's to make predictions about what's going to happen next and what the body needs to do next, and then make corrections as necessary.
Well, and I love the idea of body budgeting, and it ties into something at Qualia that we talk about a lot, and that's our brain needs energy, requires resources, and that often when we're asking it to do more or frustrated with it doing less, it's a resource, and as in your terms, almost a body budgeting issue that would be at least a useful way to think of it. And one of the other things I really enjoyed about your book is that, how you go into how we go about making predictions, is in large part based on our past, both what happened outside of us and inside. So can you, share that?
So this is really surprising. I mean, I have to be really honest and say, I'm not really sure I believe it if I did, if I wasn't a scientist and I didn't, have access not only to other people's data, but to my own. There's a lot of evidence now that brains are not, how it feels to us, right, is that we see something in the world or we hear something and then we react to it. That's not how brains are structured. It's not metabolically efficient to run a brain that way. And metabolic efficiency in your brain as well as in your body is really important, but it's really important in your brain because basically your most expensive organ is your brain. It's a 3-pound blob of meat, but it actually costs you 20% of your metabolic budget. Your brain has some model of what's happening inside the body on all the sensory surfaces of the body. And some of those sensory surfaces, like your retina in your eyes or your cochlea in your ears or the touch sensors in your skin, these are informing the brain about what's going on in the world. Now, if we stop time, your brain has some model of the sensory surfaces of the body. Sometimes scientists will say it's a model of the world. It's not really a model of the world because the brain only knows the world through the sensory surfaces of your body. So it's a model of the sensory surfaces. And based on this model, it's making a prediction about what's going to happen next. And it's using past experience to make these guesses. What it's doing is effectively guessing, well, like based on the last time you were in a state like this with this set of sensory signals, what did you do next? What did you feel next? What did you see next? This is what the brain is doing. It's making a guess, a set of guesses, really. Guesses start as guesses about how you need to regulate the internal systems of the body in order to support movement. So it's predicting the sensory consequences of the movements that your brain is currently planning. So not only are you predicting and not reacting, but actually your brain starts with the motor responses and then experience is derived from those motor responses. So it's not like you experience something, you sense something, and then you react with a motor change, like a movement. For example, what you see is very much influenced by your brain's planning where to move your eyes. It's just really, really counterintuitive, but this is what a lot of evidence suggests from lots of different scientific domains. And also when I'm giving popular science talks, I have some really nice illusions that I can show people that sort of unpack what's happening. And it's very, very gratifying to use these. I've been using them for years. And there's always this moment where you can hear the audience, like they just gasp, right? They're like, oh, because you can deconstruct what's happening in pieces so that they experience what a prediction is. So, for example, if you ever heard a song going through your head, what your brain is doing is exactly what it does when it's making a prediction. It's literally, based on past experience, changing the firing of its own neurons to anticipate the incoming sensory signals. And that is literally part of the experience that you have. Every experience you have is partly the remembered past and partly the sensory present. It's just that the remembered past comes first. Your brain's actually changing its signaling to predict the incoming sensory present.
One of the examples you give in the book that struck a chord with me was the idea of being in front of an audience and speaking. And some people, so that's a shared sensory experience. And, for most people, right? Like there's people out in the audience who are on the stage, there's external things that are happening. But then a lot of how we experience that, as whether it's stage fright or excitement, is, like what's going on in our body and our past. And I remember, like, I naturally in front of an audience would frame it as, oh, like this is an opportunity to be really alive. I only have this, one shot to show up in a meaningful way here. So I've never, like that idea of stage fright would be foreign to me. And I remember I played violin in second grade. I wasn't very good, but did some performances. And I remember at the time, some of the parents telling my mom that, oh, Greg seems so comfortable up there. But I didn't know I wasn't supposed to be comfortable, right? So my, idea had never been planted. So I just interpreted whatever those, interoception signals were. It was like, super cool. I'm alive.
Yeah, I wouldn't say you interpreted, though. I would say you constructed. So what's happening is the signals are constraining each other so that they create meaning. So what you're doing is you're literally experiencing those interoceptive signals in the context of all the other signals from the audience and, that you're seeing and hearing and stuff. And your brain is actually, these signals together, they construct what you experience. So in How Emotions Are Made, I tell this story, which unfortunately is true, about how there was, when I was in graduate school, there was this guy who kept asking me out for coffee, and I wasn't really that into him. But eventually I just, he wore me down. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll have coffee with you. And then while I'm having coffee with him, my cheeks start to flush a little, and I'm having a little bit of, my heart starts to speed up, and I'm having a little trouble concentrating, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, maybe I'm attracted to this guy. Who knew? And then, he walks me back to my apartment, and I open the door with my keys, and then I promptly drop my keys and run to the bathroom and pray to the porcelain god, as we might say. And then I was in bed with the flu for a week. And it's tempting to say that I mistook the sensations of the flu for attraction, but that is an incorrect way of understanding what the brain is doing. Your brain is trapped in a dark, silent box called your skull. It's receiving signals from the body and from the world, but it doesn't know the causes of those signals. It's receiving the effects of those causes, but it has to guess at the causes, and those guesses become your experience. So really what was happening is that I actually was experiencing attraction to this guy because my brain was making sense of those signals. It was an authentic experience. Really, every experience you have in your brain. You see in your brain. You hear in your brain. Even when you're feeling your heart beating, the feeling is in your brain. You don't feel things in your body. You receive signals from your body, and your brain makes sense of those. So what I would say is that you were experiencing being alive, and you didn't experience anything else. There weren't other options for you didn't experience it as anxiety or as a stage fright or whatever, because nobody had taught you that that's what those signals mean. Mm-hmm. And when we say mean here, I don't mean like meaning in an abstract way. I mean meaning as in, what do you do next, right? So your brain is making sense of those signals to prepare the next event of action, which then will give you the next experience.
When I think what's then the case is that that meaning that I must have, unintentionally stumbled on or constructed back then just moved forward in time with me. So, as you point out in the book, that, when there's something going on outside, and something going on inside, memory is in part used to create meaning for what
absolutely
that is.
And yes, absolutely. What is memory? Memory is not your experience of remembering something. Memory is literally your brain just reassembling signals from the past. It can do it in a very generative way, like it can take bits and pieces of the past and combine them in a novel way. But basically, it's just re-implementing signal ensembles from the past. That's memory. Like, that's what remembering is. It's reconstituting events that occurred in the past. And this is one of the important things about understanding how the brain works, because if you understand that pretty much everything you experience is a combination of meanings from the past, the signals from the sensory surfaces of your body and the signals in your brain are constraining each other to create meaning, that's really what your experience is and, what your actions are. Once you understand this, then you can kind of use that deliberately to cultivate new experiences for yourself that you can deliberately cultivate with energy, with effort. But then eventually, if you practice, your brain can start to construct experiences really easily, very effortlessly. And it becomes a set of tools that you can use to literally change your experience of the world. Control in the moment is really hard to implement for anybody, no matter how smart you are, no matter how healthy your brain is. It's just super hard to do. But if you think about control as this broader idea that you're basically cultivating new experiences for yourself before the heat of the moment, so that your brain can predict and sort of automatically construct different experiences in the moment, then you have a tool that is very, very powerful. And I will say that How Emotions Are Made was published 7 years ago at this point, and I'm still receiving emails on a pretty regular basis, almost daily, from people who find this tool and other tools that are in that book like life-changing for them.
One of the things I highlighted just to read as a quote, and it's everything you learn today seeds your brain to predict differently tomorrow. So I kind of flagged that as, that's the hope for the future, right? The things we invest in today will maybe change the meaning that we're extracting or constructing in the future.
Yeah, it's really, really hard to go back in time and change the meaning of what happens to you so that you can predict differently in the future. But what you can do is exactly what you said. It is an energy investment. It's an investment. You're spending energy when you cultivate novelty, when there's error in prediction, and your brain has to adjust its signaling to take account of that error. We have a fancy name for that in science. We call it learning.
Mm-hmm.
And learning is expensive. It's more expensive than just predicting and going with your predictions. So it is an investment, but it's a good investment. And I think also it's probably important to say this. Nobody has as much control over their experience as they would like. And it's harder for everybody to learn to predict differently. It's harder for everyone than they would like. Some people have more flexibility and more options than other people just by virtue of their life circumstances. But everybody can have more control over their experience than they currently do. And I think that's a really, really optimistic message.
I agree 100%. And one more quote that I think ties in, it was you wrote, "Sometimes we're responsible for things, not because they're our fault, but because we're the only ones who can change them." And for me, that's powerful, and it ties into that. Like, if I find myself constructing some, emotional experience or reaction to something, and in hindsight, it's like, yeah, Greg, that wasn't ideal. Like, it's, there may have been something outside of me that contributed to it. But if I want to be better next time, that's on me, because the world's probably going to send that experience back at me in the future until I get better at it.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think all animals, including humans, attempt to control their environment. It's called niche construction. Like there's this concept in ecology called an ecological niche. These are like the things that actually affect you in the world. And humans, like every other animal, attempt to construct their niche. So Greg, if I make myself more predictable to you, then you're more predictable to me, and that's actually that's a metabolic savings for me. Okay, so there are advantages to following the social rules, and if there's a set of agreed upon rules and we both follow them, we both benefit in a metabolic sense. It's just a tiny little benefit, but these tiny little costs and savings really accumulate over time, so it matters, right? But you can't control everything, and we're surrounded by humans who are probably the most unpredictable creatures that we could ever encounter. And then, of course, now we have climate control issues, and there are police, events, and there are shootings, and there are wars, and we can't control these things. And so we have to have a way of instead controlling our reactions to them. You can choose who you interact with. You can choose what you watch. You can choose what you read. You can choose what you expose yourself to. And cultivating the present differently allows you to have more flexibility over who you are in the future.
Well, the other thing that I know, reading, or I guess originally listening to 7.5 Lessons about the Brain, but then reading how emotions were made, it changed somewhat my story about people. So, one of my stories could be, wrong, but I would put it in the useful category, is that, most people start their days with more resources. So their body budget is potentially in better shape, at least from a resource perspective. And they use those up along the course of the day. And, maybe by the end of the day, they're struggling more with balancing their body budget. And so if someone, cuts me off in traffic at the end of the day, or I remember sometime after listening to your book originally, I was almost stopped, and someone, hit the back of my car. And instead of getting angry, because, we just got out to get information, it's like, oh, I get it. You probably had a rough day, right? like you're not a bad person. This was unfortunate, but so anyways, I just think that idea of, the body budget has helped me to cut people slack, that understand that it's not about their character, it's maybe more about what's going on inside them in that moment, which I can't accurately predict. So, let me get out of that game and tell the best story I can to myself about that person.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And I think understanding that there is a body budget, and again, body budgeting is a metaphor, but your brain's use, glucose and other nutrients, and your brain's regulation of the body, how the body is metabolizing. That's not a metaphor. Like, that's real. That actually is really happening. It allows you to have more compassion for people. And actually you can also have more compassion for yourself. Like, sometimes at the end of the day, I'm exhausted, and it's been a long day with a lot of stress. And what is stress? Stress is just your brain preparing your body for a big metabolic outlay. That's it. Cortisol, not a stress hormone. It's a hormone that gets glucose into your bloodstream quickly and allows your cells to be responsive to that glucose, so that your cells can metabolize that glucose, which is what you use for energy. So sometimes at the end of the day, I just don't have the spoons, as my daughter would say.
Yeah.
The best course of action, because I'm making sense of things as a depleted body budget, the best course of action is to make a bunch of deposits, go to bed, get some sleep, and start again the next morning. The one thing I do want to say, though, is that chronic stress is where, so any stress, any given event that you experience as stressful, just means your brain is preparing your body for a big metabolic outlay. That's it. There's nothing more complicated than that. When you go to exercise, that's a stress. It's a big metabolic outlay. As long as you replenish what you spend, you're okay in the long run. However, if your brain is consistently making predictions that you need to spend, and you do spend, but you don't replenish what you spend, or if your brain is mispredicting and it's not learning to predict better, then your metabolism becomes dysregulated. So, for example, if your systems keep being flushed with cortisol, but there's no metabolic outlay that is required, then the cells start to become insensitive to cortisol, and then that causes a dysregulation, which is like a precondition for depression and for diabetes and so on and so forth. So I think some people do wake up in the morning they're not feeling better in the morning than they feel late at night. And that's a clue. If that's happening to you, that you should treat that as a clue to something that you have to change in your life if you can, because it means that you are on the path to chronic stress, which is very, very, very unhealthy in a biological, non-metaphorical sense. Unhealthy for you means that you have to take better care of that budget.
That's, I think super important for listeners to pay attention to, because that, we should ideally wake feeling refreshed and restored. And if we're not, we're starting, as you said, the analogy from your daughter's a few spoons short to start the day at a minimum.
Yeah. Actually, I have a friend, Alyssa Eppel, who's a very eminent scientist. And I remember I watched her give a talk once where she was saying that if you wake up in the morning and you're already ruminating about all the things you have to do in the day and how stressful it's going to be and how it's hard to drag your ass out of bed, that's kind of a clue that you're starting the day a couple of spoons down. And that means you're going to have a harder day, and your brain's going to have a harder time controlling your body. And the whole, everything you experience is just going to have a tinge of negativity to it, because your mood, what scientists would call affect, but these like simple feelings of pleasantness, unpleasantness, feeling worked up, feeling calm. These aren't emotions. These are properties of consciousness. They're just feelings that are simple feelings that are with you all the time. And they are like a very simple barometer for how your body budget is doing.
Great. Well, in the last piece, I wanted to make sure we spent some attention to, and it will tie into that because I think it's a big area where our body budget can go haywire. You already mentioned what's chapter or lesson 3, little brains wire themselves to their world. But then in lesson number 5, your brain secretly works with other brains. And one of the things I wrote down, just as a quote, is the best thing for your nervous system is another human. The worst thing for your nervous system is also another human. And I think often, at least my experience when I was working with people, often one of the biggest stressors, for lack of a better word, would be in that social component of their experience and world.
Absolutely. So let's just start with there. Remember what I said before, that prediction error or things you don't predict, whether it's the presence of something that you didn't predict or the absence of something that you did predict. Those are moments of greater metabolic cost because your brain has to adjust. It has to adjust its firing, and that means there are all kinds of chemical and electrical things that have to happen. And so it's a little more expensive. And so humans are really sometimes unpredictable. That's why, you can, in these moments of unpredictability, they're moments of expense, but they're also opportunities to learn something new, which could be a good thing, but it's an investment, right? And so it really just depends on who you're with. I mean, one of the things I told my daughter when she went off to college was, hang around people where you can be your best self. Like basically people who are going to make you the best version of who you are. Because remember that your brain is predicting, and it's predicting based on the present moment. It's predicting what to do next, what changes inside the body need to happen, what actions you're going to take, and then your experience is the result of that. So you want to be around people who are optimally predictable, meaning they're not always predictable. That's boring, and there's no opportunity for learning. But you also don't want chaos. You don't want, like utter chaos all the time. That's super expensive. You might have one friend, like I have one friend who I think of her as very high maintenance, but she's worth it. Like she's worth the investment, so because she's a little chaotic. I can't always predict what she's going to do, but most of the time it's a good investment. But I know it's going to be a little too more taxing to interact with her. We don't run a body budget on our own, really from birth. Other people are helping to tend our body budgets. And of course, at birth, a baby can't do anything for its body budget by itself. I mean, it can't even burp by itself. It has to learn to nurse. It has to learn to, do everything. Of course, we don't think about tending our infants as if we're wiring their brains to body budget on their own eventually, or not completely on their own, but somewhat on their own. But that is actually what we're doing. That being said, we are social animals. We evolve that way, and we require other people to help us with our body budgets. And if we don't have those people, like if we're lonely or we're alone, that actually is like paying a little tax constantly. And that tax adds up over time to be quite impactful in the sense that people who are socially isolated or who are lonely end up, all things being equal, they end up dying earlier. They end up having greater number of diseases. And, for the people out there who are listening who think of themselves as being perfectly happy on their own, maybe they are. Everyone has different needs, different social needs. Some people have a body budget that's like super hard to manage, and they require a lot of social help with that. Other people are better off; they can manage with fewer number of social supports. But everybody needs somebody sometime, and if you don't have those help, that assistance, that body budgeting assistance, if you're not getting it either from the people around you or from people long ago who wrote the Bible or the Quran or poetry, from the Middle Ages or whatever it is that where you're receiving body budgeting support. If you don't have it, it's really not healthful for you. And it's why when people lose a loved one, somebody who they trust and they depended on, it can feel like they lost a part of themselves, because they lost someone who was providing body budgeting support, and that person's not there anymore, and they feel it as a loss, like physically feel it as a loss.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that both, friends, family members, and with patients when I was in practice. That, I remember thinking of a long-term couple when one of the partners in that relationship dies. It's very much like, not just figuratively, it really feels like a part of them has passed away. And I saw it even with my mom. There was whole categories of things that her body budget didn't have to worry about because my dad did all of those, and it was stressful for her in that aftermath, having to now acquire the skills to do those things. But, her body budget, managing those new predictions about things, the whole kit and caboodle, and that just took time.
Exactly. And that's exactly right. So your brain has to update its model. It has to adjust its predictions. And when it doesn't, when it takes a long time, that's usually what we refer to as complicated grief. There's nothing, that phrase just means it's taking longer for you. And I don't know, I just think you should have compassion for yourself. It's really, really hard to lose someone. A lot of things become disrupted in your life. There's a lot of prediction error. The body budgeting burden for you is very large, and it can diminish over time, but that requires, a really concerted effort. It's just like having to retrain your brain for anything, to relearn things. It takes a lot of effort, and you have to have patience, and you have to have a little compassion for yourself, and you have to make sure that you have other people to depend on, other people who can help you. And also, this is also the surprising thing, like other people you can help. There's a whole literature on how random acts of kindness and being kind to your neighbors and being kind to your friends, being kind to your family, to your children, whatever, caring for a dog, or a cat. Well, cats, they don't. Well, some cats are more dog-like in the sense. I'm probably making a bunch of cat lovers really mad now, but basically the idea is having an animal that depends on you in some way. This actually is very helpful for body budgeting. I mean, when I'm feeling really depleted, I often will like bake bread for my neighbor. And, he's amazing. Like it's this, I have these neighbors who they're in their 70s. They're like just the nicest people. My neighbor helps me with my garden and I bake stuff for them. And they're very gracious about accepting that stuff. And it makes me feel good and it makes them feel good and everybody wins.
Well, I think that sets up the final sentence I wanted to read from your book. And it's, each of us can be the kind of person who makes more deposits into other people's body budgets than withdrawals, or the kind of person who is a drain on the health and welfare of those around us. So I think it's lovely that you're adding deposits into your neighbor. So
thank you. Yeah. Well, but I think it also provides a savings for me. And so it's a win-win. The next time you go out for lunch with a friend, offer to pay for lunch, and then they can get it the next time. And then it's like a double whammy. Your friend takes you out for lunch, you take your friend out for lunch, everybody wins, and there's savings all around.
Well, thank you so much. What a treat to have you as the guest today, and to get to learn more about how you think about the brain, neuroscience, and sharing all these wonderful things from your book with the audience. So just as a reminder, we're mostly talking about what's in 7.5 Lessons About the Brain, a book I adore and which I can't recommend strongly enough. So thank you again for being with us today, Dr. Barrett.
It is a pleasure.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. The podcast is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. You should not use the information on the podcast for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease, or prescribing any medication or other treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider before taking any medication or nutritional, herbal, or homeopathic supplement, and with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this or any other podcast. Reliance on the podcast is solely at your own risk. Information provided on the podcast does not create a doctor-patient relationship between you and any of the health professionals affiliated with our podcast. Information and statements regarding dietary supplements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration and are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guests' qualifications or credibility. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to therein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.